Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Torah. In this week's parasha, we read of arguably one of the most important mitzvot of the entire Torah, the mitzvah to express appreciation and thanksgiving to God for the wonderful bounty all around us. Specifically, the Torah says, V'achalta v'savata, that when you eat and are satisfied, then uvirachta se Hashem Elokecha, shall you bless God your God. In other words, express thanksgiving to God at the conclusion of a meal. But although the Torah is specifically talking about expressing blessing at the conclusion of the meal, nevertheless, the rabbis in Brachot tell us that there is another obligation, and that is to ask God's permission before we commence our meal. And they explain it in these terms. The entire world belongs to God. L'Hashem ha'aretz u'mlo'ah. To God is the world and everything in it. Just as a person wouldn't dare to take something belonging to another human being without first asking permission, similarly also we have no right to partake and benefit of this world without asking God's permission first. And that asking of permission takes the form of saying a blessing before we eat. And so therefore, there we have it. There is an obligation to thank God after we eat, and there's an obligation to ask God's permission before we eat. There is an after blessing, and there is a before blessing. But is there perhaps an even deeper explanation for this requirement and necessity to say these blessings? Well, a few verses earlier in this week's parasha, we find another verse which says as follows, Ki lo al alechem levado yichya adam, for not on bread alone does man live, ki al kol motza pi Hashem yichya adam, but rather by the utterance of God does man live. Now what does this mean? The Holy Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria of Tzfat, explains that everything in this world is constantly animated by the Word of God. And were God to stop animating the various elements of the physical existence, they would simply cease to exist. Now this animation takes the form of divine sparks within physical creation. And therefore, the food that we eat and consume, that too has within it divine sparks. And by eating the food appropriately, we then elevate the sparks, which have become trapped in the food, and bring them up to a higher, more divine and holy level. In this way, we can understand a verse in the book of Psalms. There it says as follows, Re'evim gam tzameim. There are those who are hungry and thirsty, nafsham behem tis'atav. Their soul is in the process of expiring as a result of this hunger and thirst. That's the simple meaning of the verse. However, the Baal Shem Tov explains it on another level. The Baal Shem Tov says as follows, Re'evim gam tzameim, when you see people who are hungry and thirsty, understand that the reason for their hunger and thirst, the inner reason for their hunger and thirst, is because nafsham behem tis'atav. Their soul wishes to enwrap itself around the food. In other words, their soul is drawn to the food, because within the food there is a holy spark. The word tis'atav can mean expire. The word tis'atav could also mean to wrap itself. Within the food there is a holy spark, and their soul desires to wrap itself around that holy spark in order to elevate it and bring it up to a higher level. Now, how does the soul bring it up to a higher level? By eating appropriately. And eating appropriately means saying a blessing, invoking the name of God before eating, invoking the name of God after eating. As a result of this, those sparks which are entrapped in the food in order to animate it, give it vitality and bring it to existence, those holy sparks are now able to become freed and rejoin their divine source. So therefore, although looked at from a superficial perspective, the reason why a person's eating is because he's hungry and thirsty, the Baal Shem Tov explains that on an inner level, the reason why a person is hungry and thirsty is because his soul is attracted to the food with the purpose of elevating the divine sparks within the food. This week, my Rebbetzin and myself have been blessed with another grandchild, to our oldest son Choni and his dear wife Chanchi. A beautiful little boy who, God willing, will have his bris next week and will be named. The Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that the reason why the famous Hannah desired to have a son who later became the prophet and great Jewish leader Samuel, was not merely maternal instinct, but rather her intention was to bring a neshama, to bring a soul into this world, which would purify and elevate the world. Looked at superficially, she was a regular woman with a maternal instinct. However, as the Rebbe proves from verses of the Tanakh, of the Bible, that wasn't the real reason why she wanted to have a child. The real reason why she wanted to have a child was to bring another neshama into this world, make this world a better place. Just like the real reason why we are hungry and thirsty is not merely to satiate the desires of the body, but because we have an inner desire, a soul desire, to elevate divine sparks. May our son and daughter-in-law have the great schus and great merit of educating their young child appropriately, so that he too will be able, as they do, and as we all must, make this world a better place. In the words of the great Hasidic masters, that the entire reason why God created the world was because he wished to have an abode in the lowest of all worlds. Every time a new neshama comes into the world, we become closer to Mashiach, the Messiah, because a new neshama has been born, who has got the capacity and ability to purify and elevate the world to the level that it's capable of being in preparation for the coming of Mashiach. We wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and may you too be blessed with many smachot in your own families.